call this deal the United States-Mexico Trade Agreement.
On today's World Insight with Etienne Schneider, Mexico and the U.S. strike up a new trade deal, but is not the partner, Canada, on board with it. And it may be one of Europe's smallest states, but Luxembourg is big on plans to source minerals from asteroids.
It comes from my Space Resource.lu initiative, which I launched some 2 years ago.
Luxembourg's Deputy Prime Minister Etienne Schneider explains.
Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you live from Beijing on CGTN. We start with trade. The United States and Mexico have reached a preliminary trade deal. President Trump refuses to call it a new NAFTA. And the deal is missing a key partner, Canada. Friction due to U.S. threats of more tariffs on Canadian goods still lingers, and ties between Canada and the United States remains absolutely tense.
Donald Trump teased his news on Monday on Twitter. A big deal looking good with Mexico, he wrote. Then hours later in the Oval Office, the U.S. president announced his first significant step to replace NAFTA, the 24-year-old free trade deal with Canada and Mexico.
I like to call this deal the United States-Mexico Trade Agreement. I think it's an elegant name. I think NAFTA has a lot of bad connotations for the United States because it was a ripoff.
NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement, but missing from the new name is Canada, the other member of the trio. A spokesman for the Canadian Foreign Ministry said he was pleased that Canada's NAFTA partners had worked out their differences, but gave little indication to where Canada stood in its own negotiations. Trump, in turn, threatened Washington's neighbor to the north with tariffs on car imports if it didn't agree to his terms. Mexico's incoming foreign minister, who also stressed the need to include Canada, said this initial agreement was a good first step. But the country's incoming president, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, a populist on Mexico's political left, has voiced caution about dealing with Trump and trusting him.
Which may explain why U.S. officials are rushing to get any deal through. The American Congress needs at least 90 days to review it. López Obrador takes office on December 1st, which leaves just a few days for Canada to join this deal, where the White House may be stuck starting over with a new president and perhaps a less friendly partner down south.
For more on the U.S.-Mexico trade deal, we turn to our panelists. With us here in our Beijing studio, Zhang Gong, professor of economics from the University of International Business and Economics. In Washington, D.C., we have Maricruz McGowan, vice president of the National Economist Club. And also in Washington, D.C., Manuela Suarez-Mier, Latin American economic consultant, former chief of staff of the governor of Bank of Mexico. I want to welcome to the three of you. Let me start by asking you, Ms. McGowan, very briefly, is this gonna work? Only bilateral deal between Mexico and the United States?
I think it's going to work and even better than a trilateral agreement. Bilateral agreements are always better because it's easier to get a consensus. It's easier to negotiate each area of the trade agreement than going into a trilateral. And you have to see Canada and Mexico. They are not countries that have similar characteristics. So it's going to be better for the United States to deal first with Mexico and then with Canada. Something important to understand is that Canada is not being left out. It's just we are changing from one trilateral agreement to two bilateral agreements. So the U.S. is negotiating with Mexico first, and then the U.S. will negotiate with Canada. That's what it is, and I think it's a great deal.
Whether two bilateral agreement is possible, and whether two bilateral agreements would eventually come to a trilateral agreement. Mr. Suarez-Mier, your thought?
Well, first of all, the President doesn't have authority to negotiate bilateral agreements, period. The authorization that the one that has the privilege of negotiating trade is Congress, specifically the House of Representatives. They give authorization to the President to negotiate, and they gave it to negotiate NAFTA, not two bilateral agreements. So if these were to become two bilateral agreements, he would need to get authorization for those agreements, and he doesn't have the time or the political support to do that. So this either becomes a trilateral or we don't have a deal, period.
Okay. What about that, Professor Gong? Is this a so-called divide and conquer, as they say, with the art of war, the strategy combination from China? Or is this something that the president just don't understand what he's doing, which is likely to be the real scenario?
Well, I think from Trump's perspective, I think it's more like the first scenario described. From Donald Trump, in his world, and the trade is going to be a hub and spoke system in his mind. He wants every country to have a bilateral agreement with the United States. But there's a complicating issue here. He doesn't have the mandate from Congress to negotiate a bilateral agreement with Mexico alone. It has to be a trilateral agreement among three countries, unless he goes back to Congress to ask for a separate piece of legislation, which is going to take some more time to do that. So I'm not sure, what exact scenario he's talking about here.
Okay.
Is this the first step of a trilateral deal, or it's a separate, as he described, as a United States-Mexico bilateral trade agreement?
Well, of course, as both of you have illustrated very clearly, he does not have the authority to work on a bilateral deal because the Congress has not given him the authority unless the Congress pass another legislation suggesting to give him that power, but that would take more than ages, of course. But Mr. Suarez-Mir, here's the question that I do not understand. May I have your expertise, since you're coming from Mexico? Why is this president now sitting in the presidential house of Mexico with just a few weeks to go before the end of his term, willing to work with Donald Trump, knowing his lack of credibility in many negotiations, knowing that he doesn't have the authority to have a bilateral deal, and eventually still work with him on this temporary, at least a bilateral deal, even though the Mexican president on the phone was suggesting, let's have Canada also join in the discussion. But Canada was not joining at the very beginning, Mr. Suarez-Mir.
Well, Canada was at the very beginning, but the U.S. sort of left it out of the conversations about 5 weeks ago. A great deal of improvement and a great deal of the issues had been settled with the three countries before Canada was sidelined. And Canada is coming back to the talks today. That's one issue. Why is the Mexican president so keen in negotiating with Mr. Trump, despite his unreliability, as you suggest? Basically because NAFTA is crucially important for Mexico. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the U.S. 80%. So the proportion of our economy that depends on trade with the U.S. is huge. And the consequences of not having a trade agreement or facing tariffs and other obstacles to trade would be devastating for the Mexican economy. That's the reason.
Well, the Mexican president, the current one, of course, he said very clearly it just takes millions of jobs when we talk about the trilateral deal or NAFTA for Mexico, of course. But, ladies and gentlemen, if we take a note of what exactly is the content of this so-called bilateral agreement between the United States and Mexico for now, under Monday's preliminary agreement between the two countries, Mexico agreed to this: ensure that 75% of automotive content will be produced within Mexico and the U.S., up from current 62.5%, according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Rep. It also says that 40 to 45% of the auto content must be made by workers earning at least $16 an hour, an unprecedented requirement. But, Ms. McGowan, $16 an hour, let's just be frank here. For a Mexican worker, that's a lot of money. That probably could also mean many of those that are working in Mexico, I mean the American car manufacturers, are likely to move it away from Mexico because it's becoming so expensive. But the question is, are they going to move back to the United States? That's a big question mark, isn't it, Ms. McGowan?
Well, that's one of the reasons President Trump wants these workers, these businesses, to move back to the United States. Let's not forget, there is a big incentive here for the United States to change the rules of NAFTA. And it's not impossible, as my colleagues think. You know, the President presents it, and the Congress has 90 days to respond it. Time she has. You know, the world is not ending in 90 days. Even if it takes more than 90 days, it's going to happen. Why? Because NAFTA was not a good agreement for the United States. In 1993, before the NAFTA agreement, the deficit with Mexico was $117 billion. Right now, per year, right now it's $800 billion. Obviously, that's the incentive for the President and the United States to change the rules of the game. Then, what makes the $16? The Mexicans will have a higher standard of living, and they will have labor protections, which will be in the trade agreement. So they are going to be treated with the same standards, let's say, or similar than we have in the United States. That is an incentive also to balance, you know, the advantages and disadvantages of trade.
Okay.
I think it can be done. I think it should be done.
Well, Mr. Suarez-Mir, I saw you. You were waving your head. You apparently disagree with your colleague, Ms. McGowan, over there. So $16 an hour. That's a lot of money for Mexican workers. Good for them, but the question is, will they still have their job as a result of that? Why would Mexican president agree to something that is likely to take the jobs away from Mexico?
Well, first of all, you have to look at the details of all of this.
Let's do that.
It's only 40 to 45%. Only 40 to 45% of the production is subject to that rule. That leaves 60 to 55% out of that. So you have the bulk of the production of cars and auto parts out of that. Now, as for the 40-45% that covers also parts and assembled vehicles, you can export them directly through WTO rules, and they are subject to only 2.5% tariff. You cannot legislate wages by decree. Wages are the result of the competitiveness of the labor force, and the competitiveness of the labor force depends on the environment in which the workers are working. Let me give you an example. A worker that crosses the border with the U.S. without speaking the language, without his family, without the support of the social network that he has back home, is 5 times more productive than he is back in Mexico. The same worker. Why is that? Because the environment that surrounds him is far better for him to be productive. So what the Mexican government has to do is work on that environment to allow salaries to go up along with competitiveness, not by decree, which is complete nonsense. Because if you do it by decree, Ms. McGowan is correct. All the jobs would leave and go elsewhere.
Well, Professor Gong, you've been listening to your two colleagues earlier attentively. Your thought here, jobs or no jobs, artificially raising the salary.
Well, no company in Mexico are going to pay $16 an hour. I mean, the average going rate in Mexico right now is less than $4. So people are not going to see that kind of a rate. I mean, these rules are tailored designed to motivate, actually to force American auto companies to move back to the United States. As a matter of fact, we know that Ford was intimidated not to give up its investment plan in Mexico. This reminds me of this big phrase in the 1990s when Ross Perot was running for United States president. When NAFTA was still in discussion, he made this phrase called loud sucking sound to the south. Now I'm going to say loud sucking sound to the north. I see these trucks going on Highway 35 into Texas.
Right.
So I think clearly this is designed to make United States American auto industry to be staying within this boundary, to stay north of this wall he's going to build.
Okay.
So I think this is also not going to do good to American consumers. The American auto industry has already come out and said that you're going to see prices going to go up for American consumers.
But Mr. Suarez-Mir, if I could go back to you very briefly, the question is, this is globalization we're talking about here. Let's just be frank here. If you build a wall, that wall's going to be destroyed eventually, going to collapse because everybody can buy everything from the other parts of the world. If it's too expensive, people are just not going to buy it anymore. So will this artificially, once again, policy work? You were in disagreement with your other colleagues. Tell us what you're exactly thinking.
No, well, you have to look at the details, and you have to look at the prices and the proportions of vehicles and parts of the automotive industry that are made in Mexico and subject to this rule. Remember, it's only 40 to 45% of the production, not the whole 100%. So we can work within those lines and continue exporting. And as I said, in those items that we cannot fulfill the $16 per hour rule in wages, we can always go the route of exporting to the U.S. Via the WTO rules, the most favored nation, and the tariffs that you face there are 2.5%.
All right.
So
well,
this is not the end of the world in any sense.
It's not the end of the world, but it's certainly an interesting part of the world that we are talking about. 40 to 45%. If it really comes into reality, that's quite a large number if we think about that. Having said that, though, Ms. McGowan, I want to have your final points about this argument too.
Well, the thing is, it's not a decree. It's going to be part of the agreement. Bottom line, as you said, this is what is happening. Mexico has been benefiting tremendously from this NAFTA agreement since 1994 at the expense of the United States. And the United States is saying enough. So Mexico has two choices. You know, they can still benefiting, but not at this exaggerated rate. And as I said, at the expense of the United States, they can still benefit, but not so much. Okay. And the United States is trying to get a fairer trade. That's what it is.
Mr. Suarez-Mir, you were saying nonsense. I did catch that phrase. Even you stated very straightforward, and probably you need to provide us why you were suggesting that word. Very briefly from you, sir.
Both countries have benefited enormously. This concept that Mexico has benefited and harmed the U.S. is complete nonsense, as I said. It doesn't make any sense. Let's go to the numbers and let's see how welfare in both countries has improved. The number of jobs that have been created in the U.S. as a result of NAFTA is 10 or 12 million jobs.
Okay.
So the concept that Mexico has taken unfair advantage of the U.S. is in the deranged minds of people like Mr. Trump.
Okay, so obviously we see the division between you and Ms. McGowan. One is suggesting that, well, Mexico benefited tremendously from the bilateral trade with the United States, so let them bite the bullet just a little bit. They are still going to survive and they're going to like it. And you, sir, is trying to suggest, Mr. Suarez-Mir, you know, why everybody's benefiting. That's why we have a trade deal. So we'll leave that for further discussion. But the question is, Professor Gong, as an outsider, but certainly a close observer, Canada is not here. So let's just talk very pragmatically. If Canada is not here, it's not going to be NAFTA, and the Congress is not going to ratify it, even though they will be notified, the so-called by the end of this week, but still a long way to go. So, Professor Gong, is Canada going to come in from your perspective? Is the picture bilaterally apparently set between Mexico and the United States tremendously changed as a result of Canada's participation, Professor Gong?
Yeah, well, I mean, from Canada's perspective, the stumbling block is the dairy tariff. You know, Canada does have a very high tariffs on dairy imports from the United States, and as you know, the United States, the state of Wisconsin, for example, state of New York, have a very vibrant dairy industry. They would like to export their products to the north, and that's a thorny issue here. But I think overall, you know, my guess is that Canada might be actually onto this deal. They probably may make some concessions on the dairy tariffs because it's not a very large market after all. And Canada's exports of automobiles to the United States is a very big industry. You know, there are several companies have manufacturing plants in Canada. For example, Toyota has a big manufacturing facility in Canada. So I think there's a chance that probably, in my opinion, Canada will probably get onto this deal, and probably we're going to have a new NAFTA again among these three countries.
Ms. McGowan, for Canada, there are a lot of issues that we need to work out, for example, about dairy, about agriculture, and some of the other issues with the United States and also with Mexico. So the timeline we are looking at could be much more than just the end of this month before the Mexican president right now in the office going out of the office to change for another person. So what kind of timeline are we looking at? How is that timeline working necessarily with the political cycle? We all understand very well in the United States, a midterm election is going to have an impact on all policies. So how are we seeing this parallel timeline going?
It's going to be very complicated because starting December 1st, Mexico is having a new president, and in November, the U.S. is having the congressional election. So it will depend on how Congress looks like in November to see what kind of support President Trump is going to get to support that. It doesn't mean that all Democrats are going to vote against it. Don't forget that the politics when you're choosing a president is national, but the politics when you're choosing a congressman is local. So that congressman or woman, they have to respond to their districts. And if their districts want to have more American workers working in their factories, it could be Nebraska or Oklahoma or any other state, then they are going to support President Trump. That's what they are talking about.
Yeah, but I have to be frank here, it's which comes first thing, isn't it, Mr. Suarez-Mir, because the Congress will give the authority to the president only when there is trilateral deal for negotiated by the administration. But if it's only between Mexico and the United States, it's not going to happen. So when... Yeah, even after midterm election,
it could happen.
Go ahead, Ms. McGowan, very briefly.
It could happen because it's not a constitutional change. It's not in the Constitution. It's just an agreement. It's a trade agreement. Trade agreements can and should be changed, should be amended, and should be improved, because that's the way to the trade and negotiation.
Mr. Suarez-Mir, much chance that that can be amended, that can be changed with only two parties?
No, you require, the law as it stands today requires a trilateral agreement.
Right.
Otherwise, that law would have to be changed, and the president would have to ask for permission from Congress to negotiate bilaterals, which is, I don't see the possibility of that anytime soon. Now, the trilateral can be approved by the lame duck session of Congress between November and January, if it's sent at the right time. So it will depend on the negotiations with Canada that we start today.
Okay, before we go, Professor Gong, very briefly, how is this likely to impact on the overall global debate about trade? And also, don't forget NAFTA, TPP, and several other key words people have been talking about. Very briefly from you, Professor
I'll
Gong.
just talk about the auto industry. I think it's going to make the American auto industry less competitive. For example, it will make the cars in the United States more expensive. It will also make the cars, American cars, to be sold in Mexico to be more expensive. You know, the auto industry is moving towards the new energy cars, all electric cars, and in that regard, I think United States, the auto industry in the U.S. is going to lag behind if it's not going to be globalized. It's going to be, confined in the walls that's going to be built along the Mexico border. And Mexico has a very vibrant auto parts industry. If it's not going to be taken advantage by the American auto industry, it's not going to do any good service to the Americans themselves.
So you're saying catch up with the time. Well, we have to wrap it up for now because of the limits of the time. Thank you so much for the thrill of you coming from very different perspectives about this issue. John Gong, Mary Cruz McGowan, Manuel Suarez-Mir, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Stay with us here on World Insight on CGTN. Still to come on the program, I sat down with Luxembourg's the Deputy Prime Minister to talk about his country's big plans to source minerals from the outer space, one of the innovative ways to develop its economy. Get up to speed on steroid mining right after this break. Welcome back. You're still watching World Insight with me, Tian Wei. The program is coming to you Monday to Friday on CGTN. Luxembourg is one of Europe's smallest countries that used to build its economy around iron and steel, but don't let its size fool you. It is eyeing outer space to source minerals through asteroid mining. The first mission is expected within the next 3 years. Much of this effort is due to Etienne Schneider, then Luxembourg's deputy prime minister, who wants to turn the country into an outer space powerhouse.
One of Europe's tiniest states now holds claim to being a giant in the space industry. Luxembourg, known as the leading private banking center in the Eurozone, now generates nearly 2% of its annual GDP from the space industry, the highest of any country. Luxembourg's Space Resources Initiative is its plan to position the country as the European heart of exploration and use of space resources. Space mining is Luxembourg's present focus. From around 30 companies in Luxembourg's space sector, there is a vast pool of talent and expertise in satellite telecommunications. They draw on the pool for the development of extracting resources from the moon or from thousands of asteroids. The first asteroid prospecting missions are expected within the next 3 years. Eventually, celestial mining firms hope to harvest materials that can be processed in space and then used for on-site construction to sustain human life in space or, in the very long term, shipped back and sold on Earth.
Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
You have been nicknamed by some as the space miner in your country. How did that name come from?
Well, I guess it comes from my spaceresource.lu initiative, which I launched some 2 years ago, where we really want to bring our country into space, meaning that we want to develop commercial activities in space. And that's an initiative we took 2 years ago, as I said, and which has a tremendous success.
But people would say that's quite ambitious for a country like Luxembourg and having an outer space plan.
35 years ago, we launched, as a government, together with private investors, the satellite company SES, which is now one of the biggest commercial satellite operators in the world. And that was, at that time, a very ambitious idea. And many people didn't believe in Luxembourg being able to develop this kind of space activities, but now we are one of the leaders.
There are several things that you need to handle, I guess, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister. One is the international legislation, whether we have some agreements about that. Secondly, of course, technological. And thirdly, what about the international cooperation in terms of developing it, because Luxembourg will not be able to do it alone. So all of these, how could it happen?
When I was discussing with many different startups in this kind of business, they were telling me that they've got some problems to find investors because the property question is not solved by the United Nations Space Treaty, which dates back to 1967. And at that time, doing business in space or doing space mining was just science fiction. So nobody was addressing this question. So what we did was in analysis of the international legal framework, and then we decided to get a proper legal framework in Luxembourg, which allows companies to harvest minerals, for instance, in space and to own them, to possess them, and to commercialize them. And that's a very, very important step in order to allow these companies to develop themselves, in order to make their lives easier because they need to find investors. What we are working on right now is to put in place a fund, an investment fund, in order to invest into these startups. And that's what we are discussing right now with different investors. And I guess we will have this fund in a few months' time.
What kind of scale are you looking at in the very near future?
We want to be, let's say, the host nation of all these companies which want to develop space business in space. You know, there's quite a lot of different areas where we want to cooperate. For instance, exchange of information, then working together on research and development activities, putting our forces together. My aim is to bring all the like-minded countries around the table and to discuss together with them what are our aims, where do we want to get, and how can we do so as soon as possible and as cheap as possible.
Now you see a lot of debates in Europe when it comes to immigrants, when it comes to how to solicit the best talents from around the world. How do you, as the Deputy Prime Minister of your country, see that issue?
We have always had a completely open economy. We have always been completely open to all kinds of investors and also to all kinds of people who wanted to work in Luxembourg.
But now people say the trend is different. The wind is blowing the other way around. People want to say, my country first.
Luxembourg counts now 47% of foreigners living in the country, and we don't even have a right-wing party which is fighting against these foreigners. So, you know, everybody in Luxembourg knows that we need this foreign workforce, we need this immigration, and we need foreign capital to be invested.
What about outside your country? You're part of the EU. I mean, you cannot draw on your own policy just like that. You have to negotiate with the rest of the EU countries. Yeah. What about that part?
I must tell you that it's something which makes me a little bit sad. If I'm seeing these more nationalistic debates getting back into the European Union, in some of the European Union countries, I can just tell them that it's not the right way to go. And it has never been a solution to anything.
But the question is your voice big enough, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, inside the EU?
Yeah, apparently not. Apparently not, because otherwise some countries would not close their doors as they're doing or trying to do right now.
So
but
what can you do?
We are fighting for it. We are fighting for it on the European Union level. But as you said, we are a small country with small voting rights. But on the other hand, we are trying to convince other countries to stay open and to not abolish immigration. Because you know, Europe is quite an old continent, and people are getting quite old, or are quite old in
aging
Europe.
population.
Exactly, aging of the population it will be a big issue in the years to come. So we should be a little bit wiser and a little bit more forward-looking.
Okay, the scenario is people will listen to you, or they see their own interest in listening to ideas like what you have just said. The other scenario is they wouldn't. There are only two options. And therefore, how would Luxembourg be able to function if the option is not the best one that you would prefer?
Nobody can forbid Luxembourg to be an open country and to accept immigration into our country. So, you know, if the other countries don't want to understand how important immigration is, not only for the economy but also for the survival of their countries in the long term, we understand it, and we will continue having immigration in Luxembourg.
And therefore, there are very confusing political landscape in the EU as to who will be the leadership, who has the quality of being the leadership, which direction will the leadership lead the rest of the EU to go, even though it is a very equal membership entity. So, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, what do you make of this apparent chaotic situation? What is the logic that Luxembourg is keen on among all these mixed up pictures?
The years after 2008 have been very difficult for many of the European Union countries. And so the country is more and more divided on different important European topics.
That's right.
And we are quite happy to see that finally France and Germany seem to go into the same direction, meaning that Europe must become stronger again. But still, you're right, there are some countries which are going into the other direction. And that's a problem we will have to tackle. But the good thing is, you know, governments come and they go again. So the policy is changing also every 4 to 5 years. So if you have countries which are, let's say, more Eurosceptic, you have the chance that maybe a few years later there will be another government which will be more favorable.
Luxembourg, of course, is very keen on designing its own blueprint about its own future. In this big picture, where does the relationship between Luxembourg and China fall?
China was always a very good partner. And there was a big difference, I guess, between Luxembourg and many other, or let's say at least many big European countries towards China. Because many of them want to protect their economies against Chinese investors, because they want to protect their national champions. We never had national champions in that way, apart from the steel industry.
Right.
But you know, we never closed our doors, and we never tried to avoid Chinese investments in Luxembourg. The opposite is the case. We are coming to China in order to find investors which might use Luxembourg as their European hub, as their gateway to Europe, and we really help them to develop their activities.
Right.
And I think that's a big difference between many other countries. We never had any single problem with one of our Chinese investors in Luxembourg. And you know that the Bank of China is the first Chinese bank outside of China. And it was, they came to Luxembourg, and Madame Zhou Lihong, who is the CEO of the bank, she's a good friend of mine, because due to all our collaboration, due to the fact that we really have very tight links to our Chinese community in Luxembourg, there's mutual trust and understanding.
Right. But what about the Belt and Road Initiative? There are different views about that. Some of those from Europe might be skeptical about it. What is your view, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister? What does China want to do you think, with this?
You know, first of all, we fully support this initiative because we think it's the right way to do. Second, and here again, Luxembourg was the first non-Asian country to become a member of the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. So there again, and I can tell you that there was some pressure from some other countries.
What kind of pressure?
Pressure not to become a member of this.
Remember at the time when you were making this decision, what was the pressure that you were facing at the time?
You know,
would you like to describe in words to me?
I will not tell you which country, but it was a very big country, which didn't really want us to become a part of this initiative. But, you know, we didn't care about that because, as I told you before, we have a really good experience with our Chinese partners, and that's why we wanted to show that we will continue supporting China in developing their activities. And the One Belt, One Road initiative is really something which we think will be in the interest not only of China, but of all other countries which participate at it.
Which stage do you think that has already been developing to?
Well, that's a good question. That's a good question which I will not be able to answer to you right now because, you know, I don't have the insight into all of these activities.
There are some issues, as you said, sir, you're very keen on, and yet maybe different compared to some of the other countries. One of those is about what to do with tech companies internationally. People see these companies are becoming sometimes even bigger than middle-sized countries, and data providing a lot of power. But at the same time, they also provide a lot of convenience to people that are using these services. How do you see, as a national leader, the growth of these kind of companies and the relationship between countries, governments, and these businesses?
You know, I don't really see a big problem having these big companies. I see more problem in cybersecurity, protection of information, of data. All this will be, or is already, a tremendous challenge for the countries in order to regulate all this. I mean, you know, in order to make sure that your data is not used when you don't want it to be used by others. So I see the problem more in that perspective. And then maybe on the maybe there's another problem. We have to make sure that these companies also pay taxes somewhere. Because,
and that could be an issue. For example, your country is related to right now.
Absolutely. That is an issue, and that is an important issue. And we have to make sure that these companies have to pay their fair share somewhere. But nowadays, with all the possibilities they have, and due to the huge impact they can have on nation states, they are quite successful in avoiding taxes. And I think we should find a way to make them pay their fair share wherever they are active. Not in one single country, but wherever they are active.
So thank you so much, Mr. Deputy Prime Minister, for being with us. With that, we're come to the end of today's program. That is all the time we have. We'd like to see you to check more about our program. Type in World Insight CGTN into your search engine or check out our YouTube channel. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Sina Weibo. From Etienne Wei and everyone on the World Insight team, thanks for watching. Tune in again next time for insights across China and around the world.